Medieval popular psychology was not really psychology in the modern sense, and it was not especially popular either. But it did have strong opinions about why people behaved the way they did, and it shared those opinions with great confidence and very little evidence. If you were anxious, sad, impulsive, lazy, or simply annoying, the explanation was rarely complicated. Something inside you was unbalanced, overheated, undercooked, or flowing in the wrong direction. Medieval thinkers believed the human mind was inseparable from the body, which meant thoughts, emotions, and personality traits were governed by fluids, temperatures, and vague internal movements that no one could see but everyone felt qualified to describe. The most influential idea was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These substances were believed to determine not just health, but temperament. Too much blood made you cheerful and reckless. Excess black bile made you gloomy and introspective, which conveniently explained both depression and poetry. Phlegm caused sluggishness, yellow bile caused anger, and balance, in theory, caused normal behavior, though very few people seemed to achieve that. When someone acted strangely, the solution was not reflection or therapy, but intervention. You were bled, purged, starved, or prescribed a carefully chosen diet designed to cool, warm, dry, or moisten your inner landscape. Medieval psychology was less about understanding the mind and more about adjusting it, like poorly calibrated farm equipment. Dreams were treated as meaningful, but inconsistent. Sometimes they were divine messages, sometimes warnings from the body, and sometimes just the result of eating the wrong thing before bed. A dream about fire might mean passion, illness, or hell, depending on who you asked and how recently they had eaten cheese. Memory was believed to reside in physical compartments of the brain, which was imagined less as a network and more as a storage building with rooms. Damage one room, and you lost imagination. Damage another, and you forgot names. This was considered advanced thinking. Emotions were not personal experiences so much as weather events occurring inside the chest. Love overheated the heart. Fear cooled it. Melancholy settled like fog. Advice for emotional distress often involved changing surroundings, listening to music, walking in gardens, or avoiding certain colors, which sounds gentle until you remember this existed alongside bloodletting and leeches. Self-control was praised, but not for psychological reasons. Strong emotions were dangerous because they disrupted bodily balance, and an unbalanced body was a short walk away from illness, madness, or sin. Mental illness was rarely distinguished from moral failure or spiritual weakness. Someone hearing voices might be inspired, cursed, possessed, or physically ill, depending on how useful their condition was to the people around them. There was no clear line between personality, pathology, and prophecy. Medieval advice literature confidently explained how to shape your character by managing your habits, diet, sleep, posture, and even facial expressions. Smiling too much was suspicious. Thinking too deeply was risky. Thinking too little was expected. Overthinking, though not named as such, was often blamed on excess black bile and treated accordingly, which meant more regulation and fewer questions. Popular psychology in the medieval world worked because it offered simple explanations for complex human behavior. If you were sad, it was not because life was difficult, unpredictable, and largely outside your control. It was because something inside you was literally too wet or too dry. This was comforting in its own way. It meant suffering had a cause and a treatment, even if neither was accurate. Medieval psychology did not ask how you felt about your problems. It assumed the problem was physical, cosmic, or divinely assigned, and then moved on. In that sense, it functioned less as a science of the mind and more as a manual for enduring existence with minimal introspection, which, considering the era, was probably considered a feature, not a flaw. This approach also meant that personal responsibility for emotional well-being was framed in strangely mechanical terms. If you felt unhappy, you were expected to correct yourself not by changing circumstances, but by adjusting routines, meals, and moral discipline. Sleep too much, and your mind would grow dull. Sleep too little, and your thoughts would overheat. Eat heavy foods, and your imagination would sink. Eat light foods, and your body might weaken, which was somehow also a mental problem. Moderation was praised endlessly, though few guidelines explained what moderation actually looked like for anyone living on bread, ale, and seasonal despair. Children were believed to be especially malleable, their minds soft and easily warped by bad habits, improper instruction, or excessive affection. Education was not just about learning facts, but about shaping temperament, because a poorly shaped temperament was assumed to become a poorly shaped soul. Fear, for example, was considered contagious and physically harmful. Too much fear could cool the heart, weaken the body, and invite illness. Courage, on the other hand, warmed the blood and strengthened character, though reckless courage still counted as imbalance. Everything had a narrow, acceptable range, and almost no one lived inside it. Women were thought to be particularly vulnerable to emotional instability, not because of social conditions, but because their bodies were believed to be colder, wetter, and therefore more prone to excess imagination and melancholy. This conveniently explained everything from sadness to dissent. Men, meanwhile, were expected to regulate their emotions firmly, since failure to do so suggested weakness of both body and virtue. Anger was dangerous but sometimes useful. Sadness was tolerated briefly but discouraged long-term. Joy was acceptable in moderation, ideally quiet joy. Excessive happiness suggested foolishness or moral looseness, which was also a psychological issue somehow. There was no expectation that life should make you happy. Emotional comfort was not a goal, stability was. When medieval writers discussed the mind, they often sounded confident while admitting very little certainty. They borrowed from ancient authorities, especially those long dead and impossible to question, and repeated their ideas with minor adjustments. If something did not make sense, that was rarely considered a flaw. It simply meant the explanation was subtle, hidden, or known only to God. Popular psychology worked best when it discouraged excessive curiosity about one's inner life. Too much self-examination was thought to cause imbalance, anxiety, or moral decay. Thinking about your thoughts too often was itself a symptom. The ideal mind was calm, obedient, and not particularly introspective. This made medieval psychology very good at maintaining social order. If distress could be explained as bodily imbalance or spiritual weakness, there was little reason to question authority, poverty, or constant uncertainty. Your sadness was internal. Your fear was personal. Your confusion was physiological. The system did not need fixing. You did. Advice manuals often promised peace of mind through routine, fixed prayer times, predictable work, limited leisure, and controlled exposure to stimulation. Silence was praised. Solitude was dangerous, unless carefully managed. Community was necessary, but exhausting. Most emotional guidance came down to endurance. Feel less, want less, expect less. Medieval psychology was not designed to make people thrive. It was designed to help them survive without asking too many questions about why survival felt so difficult. And in fairness, it probably succeeded at that. When life expectancy was short, medicine was uncertain, and control over one's future was minimal. A psychological system that discouraged rumination and rewarded acceptance may have felt practical. The problem was not that medieval psychology was entirely useless. It was that it explained too much with too little, and did so with remarkable confidence. It offered clarity without accuracy and reassurance without understanding, which, for a world that rarely slept well and had very little time for self-doubt, was apparently good enough. This confidence extended into explanations for behavior that today would be described as personality traits, coping mechanisms, or psychological disorders, though medieval writers would not have separated these ideas so neatly. Someone who worried excessively was not anxious, they were melancholic. Someone who acted impulsively was not impulsive, they were sanguine. Someone who withdrew from others was not overwhelmed, they were cold and dry in temperament. Labels were tidy, and once applied, they required very little follow-up. There was no expectation of growth or change beyond constant self-regulation. You did not become a different person. You merely attempted to keep your internal fluids from misbehaving. When people failed to do this, which was often, the blame rarely fell on the theory. It fell on the individual. Popular sermons, medical texts, and household guides reinforced the idea that mental stability was fragile and easily lost through indulgence, idleness, or excessive thought. Leisure was dangerous because it allowed the mind to wander, and wandering minds were rarely trusted. Even imagination, which we now consider a creative strength, was treated with suspicion. Too much imagination meant you were detached from reality, vulnerable to temptation, or quietly unwell. Art and music were permitted in controlled doses, not to explore emotion, but to soothe it back into compliance. Laughter was healthy until it was not. Silence was virtuous until it became isolation. Everything existed on a narrow ridge between excess and deficiency, and falling off either side was considered a personal failure. Advice for mental distress often sounded practical while remaining deeply vague. Walk more, pray steadily, eat carefully, avoid extremes, do not dwell on troubling thoughts, except when examining your sins, which required a different kind of dwelling. Confession served as a kind of emotional release, though it focused less on feelings and more on correction. You were not asked how your sadness felt. You were asked what you had done wrong. If the answer was unclear, the sadness itself could be the wrongdoing. Popular psychology also intersected heavily with astrology. Your temperament might be influenced by the position of planets at your birth, which meant your emotional tendencies were both internal and cosmically assigned. This was convenient. It explained why some people struggled more than others, without requiring structural explanations. If you were prone to melancholy, perhaps Saturn had been unhelpful that day. The solution was not resistance, but accommodation. Live within your limits. Know your weaknesses. Do not expect too much joy. The mind was something to manage, not to understand. Medieval psychology rarely asked why suffering existed. It focused instead on how to endure it properly. Endurance was praised as wisdom. Complaints were signs of imbalance. Hope was permitted, but only the restrained kind. Ambition was risky. Desire was exhausting. Emotional restraint was framed as strength, even when it bordered on numbness. Over time, these ideas filtered into everyday thinking. Parents corrected children's moods early. Adults monitored their own reactions constantly. Communities tolerated distress as long as it remained quiet and productive. Loud sorrow was disruptive. Visible fear was contagious. Private despair was acceptable if it did not interfere with work or prayer. In this way, medieval popular psychology functioned less like guidance and more like regulation. It taught people how not to feel too much, think too deeply, or expect relief. The system did not promise happiness. It promised order. And for many, order was the only comfort available. When modern readers look back, it is tempting to dismiss medieval psychology as foolish or primitive, but its persistence suggests it served a purpose. It provided explanations that felt stable in an unstable world. It turned invisible suffering into something measurable, even if the measurements were imaginary. It reassured people that distress had a cause, a name, and a method of control, however flawed. What it lacked in accuracy, it made up for in certainty. And certainty, especially when spoken calmly and repeatedly, has always been soothing. Not because it is true, but because it asks very little of the listener. That calm certainty also shaped how medieval society responded when the system failed, which it frequently did. When someone's distress became too visible, too disruptive, or too difficult to quietly manage, the explanation shifted again. What could not be contained by humors, routine, or moral correction was often reclassified as spiritual danger. Possession, temptation, or divine testing became the language of last resort. This was not necessarily meant as punishment, though it often felt like one. It was simply another framework that required even less psychological curiosity. If a person behaved unpredictably, it was not because they were overwhelmed, traumatized, or exhausted. It was because something external had entered them, or something internal had gone catastrophically wrong. Either way, the solution was no longer understanding, but removal. Prayer replaced observation. Isolation replaced care. Correction replaced support. Medieval psychology did not escalate gently. It moved from reassurance to suspicion with very little warning. Yet for those whose distress stayed within acceptable boundaries, the system offered a strange kind of comfort. You did not have to explain yourself in detail. You did not have to analyze your childhood, your relationships, or your sense of purpose. You only had to accept that something was out of balance and comply with the prescribed adjustments. Drink this, avoid that, think less, rest more, or possibly the opposite. Precision was not the point. Participation was. The act of doing something, however ineffective, was considered therapeutic. This made medieval popular psychology extremely adaptable. When treatments failed, new ones were added, without questioning the foundation. More herbs, different diets, revised routines, alternate planetary influences. The theory never broke, because it was never tested in a way that allowed it to fail. It existed alongside suffering, not in opposition to it. People were expected to carry their emotional weight quietly, efficiently, and with minimal disruption to others. Excessive grief was tolerated briefly, then discouraged. Chronic sadness was treated as a flaw in regulation. Anxiety was a weakness of balance. Joy was safest when muted. Emotional extremes were dangerous not because they hurt the individual, but because they threatened order. Medieval psychology was less concerned with internal well-being than with external stability. It taught people how to feel just enough to function, nothing more. Over time, this produced a cultural attitude toward the mind that was cautious, restrained, and deeply suspicious of introspection. Looking inward too long was considered unhealthy. Asking too many questions about one's feelings was indulgent. The ideal mental state was one that required no explanation. You worked, you prayed, you slept, you endured. Anything beyond that was unnecessary and potentially harmful. Even wisdom was defined narrowly. A wise person was not someone who understood themselves deeply, but someone who reacted predictably and moderately to whatever happened. Emotional flexibility was not valued. Consistency was. This meant that medieval popular psychology could coexist comfortably with harsh conditions. Hunger, loss, illness, and uncertainty were not problems to be processed emotionally. They were facts to be managed practically. The psychological framework did not aim to reduce suffering. It aimed to prevent suffering from becoming disruptive. In that sense, it was remarkably effective. It allowed communities to function under constant strain without collapsing into collective despair. The cost, of course, was paid privately. Feelings that could not be expressed were redirected inward. Distress that could not be named became routine. People learned to live with a background level of discomfort and consider it normal. Modern readers often laugh at medieval ideas about humors and planetary influence, but the more unsettling part is how familiar the underlying attitude feels. Endure quietly. Do not overthink. Adjust yourself, not the system. Accept imbalance as personal failure. Medieval psychology did not invent these ideas. It simply formalized them. It provided a language that made emotional restraint sound intelligent and suffering sound manageable. And it delivered this message calmly, confidently, and without apology. Which is why, centuries later, it still sounds oddly persuasive. Not because it understood the mind, but because it offered something many people still want when they are overwhelmed. A simple explanation, a clear rule, and permission to stop asking difficult questions and just carry on. This permission to stop asking questions may be the most quietly effective feature of medieval popular psychology, because it relieved people of the exhausting task of self-explanation in a world that offered very few satisfying answers. When survival required constant attention to food, weather, labor, and obedience, there was little space for extended reflection on one's inner life. Medieval psychology fit neatly into that reality. It reduced emotional complexity into manageable categories that required action rather than understanding. You did not need to know why you felt restless, only that restlessness meant imbalance, and imbalance required correction. This made the system easy to teach, repeat, and enforce. It could be absorbed through sermons, household advice, medical manuals, and casual conversation. Everyone knew roughly what was expected of a stable mind, even if no one quite achieved it. Emotional suffering became something you handled privately, quietly, and efficiently. Like a minor injury, you did not mention unless it interfered with work. Even grief had a timetable. Mourning was acceptable for a period, but lingering sorrow raised suspicion. At some point, sadness stopped being a response and became a defect. Medieval psychology did not encourage people to move through emotions. It encouraged them to return to baseline as quickly as possible. Baseline, however, was not happiness. It was functionality. You were meant to feel just enough to pray properly, work steadily, and behave predictably. Anything beyond that was considered excess. Over time, this shaped how people spoke about themselves. Emotional language was limited. Feelings were described indirectly, through bodily sensations or moral categories. You were heavy of heart, weak of spirit, overheated, or sluggish. These descriptions allowed distress to exist without requiring emotional disclosure. They also allowed advice to remain impersonal. If sadness was black bile, then anyone with black bile needed the same response. Individual experience did not matter much. This approach also protected authority. If distress could be explained as personal imbalance, there was no need to question social structures, power arrangements, or chronic hardship. The system was assumed to be fixed. The individual was adjustable. Medieval popular psychology reinforced this assumption gently but consistently. It rarely said you were wrong to feel bad. It simply implied that feeling bad was a sign you had failed to manage yourself properly. This framing was subtle, but effective. It discouraged complaint without openly forbidding it. It encouraged self-correction without promising relief. It allowed suffering to continue while making it feel necessary, even instructive. In some texts, suffering was presented as beneficial, a tool for moral refinement. Enduring discomfort patiently was not just practical, it was virtuous. This made emotional restraint feel meaningful rather than repressive. If you were unhappy, perhaps that unhappiness was improving you. Perhaps it was making you more disciplined, more humble, more prepared for whatever came next. The idea that suffering might be pointless was rarely entertained. Popular psychology did not ask whether distress could be reduced. It asked how it could be carried correctly. This distinction mattered. It shaped generations of thinking about the mind as something to be controlled rather than understood. Even moments of apparent kindness, such as recommending music, gardens, or companionship for melancholy, were framed as corrective measures, not explorations. These activities were meant to restore balance, not to uncover meaning. Reflection was allowed only insofar as it led back to regulation. Too much introspection risked destabilization. Too little awareness was safer. The mind, in this view, was not a place to wander freely. It was a space to be monitored. This created a culture where emotional quietness was mistaken for health. Calm appearances mattered more than internal states. As long as you functioned, your mind was considered acceptable. This attitude did not disappear when medieval theories faded. The language changed, the humors vanished, the planets lost influence, but the preference for endurance over understanding lingered. Modern readers may smile at medieval psychology's confidence in imaginary fluids and cosmic alignment, but its deeper legacy is less amusing. It normalized the idea that suffering is manageable if you simply endure it correctly. It taught people to distrust their own emotional complexity and favor simple explanations delivered with authority. Medieval popular psychology may have been made-up nonsense in its details, but its tone was precise, calm, certain, undemanding. It did not ask people to heal. It asked them to cope quietly. And for a world that had very little patience for vulnerability and very few tools to address it, that may have been exactly what it was designed to do. This quiet emphasis on coping rather than healing also shaped what medieval people expected from authority figures who dealt with the mind, whether they were physicians, priests, or scholars. None of them were expected to ask many personal questions. Their role was not to listen deeply, but to diagnose quickly and prescribe confidently. A physician might examine pulse, urine, complexion, and posture, then declare the temperament misaligned. A priest might listen briefly, then redirect the problem towards sin, patience, or divine order. In both cases, certainty mattered more than accuracy. Hesitation suggested ignorance. Doubt undermined trust. Medieval popular psychology rewarded those who sounded sure, even when they explained very little. This meant that people learned to accept explanations that felt authoritative rather than helpful. If a respected figure named your distress and told you how to correct it, that was often enough. Relief came not from improvement, but from being classified. Once labeled, your discomfort made sense. It belonged somewhere. You could stop wondering what was wrong with you and focus instead on managing what you had been told you were. This reduced anxiety in the short term, even if nothing actually changed. The system was emotionally efficient, if not emotionally effective. It also discouraged disagreement. Questioning a diagnosis was seen as arrogance or denial, not curiosity. If your prescribed remedies failed, it was assumed you had not followed them properly, or that your imbalance was unusually stubborn. The theory itself remained untouched. Medieval psychology was not designed to evolve through contradiction. It evolved through accumulation. New explanations were layered on top of old ones, creating a dense web of ideas that could accommodate almost any outcome. Improvement confirmed the system. Continued suffering also confirmed the system, just differently. This flexibility made it durable. It also made it difficult to escape. People internalized its assumptions early. From childhood, they learned that emotions were risky, desire was destabilizing, and excessive thought was dangerous. Calmness was praised. Curiosity was tolerated briefly, then redirected. By adulthood, many people did not need external correction. They monitored themselves. They adjusted their behavior preemptively. They avoided emotional expression not because it was forbidden, but because it felt imprudent. Medieval popular psychology trained people to become their own regulators. This self-regulation was framed as maturity, wisdom, and virtue. Emotional quietness became a social skill. Those who mastered it were considered reliable. Those who failed were seen as unstable, regardless of circumstance. This created a culture where suffering was expected, but expression was optional and often discouraged. Even joy was treated carefully. Celebration was permitted on certain days, in certain forms, for certain reasons. Excess enthusiasm was childish. Excess grief was embarrassing. Excess fear was contagious. Emotional moderation was not just personal discipline, it was civic responsibility. Your feelings were not only your own, they affected others. Therefore, you were expected to manage them discreetly. Medieval psychology provided the moral language to justify this expectation. It taught that balance was health, restraint was wisdom, and endurance was strength. Over time, these ideas blended so completely into daily life that they stopped sounding like theory at all. They became common sense. People did not think of themselves as following a psychological framework. They simply believed this was how the mind worked. When suffering persisted, it was accepted as normal. Life was difficult. The mind reflected that difficulty. There was no promise that emotional pain would be resolved, only that it could be carried properly. This mindset made medieval popular psychology strangely compatible with long-term hardship. It did not collapse under pressure because pressure was assumed. In a world of unpredictable harvests, frequent illness, and limited mobility, a psychological system that minimized emotional expectation may have felt realistic. Hope existed, but it was narrow and carefully controlled. Improvement was possible, but modest. Stability was the goal. Anything beyond that was dangerous ambition. Modern psychology often emphasizes insight, expression, and change. Medieval psychology emphasized order, restraint, and acceptance. Neither approach is neutral. Each reflects the conditions in which it developed. Medieval popular psychology was shaped by scarcity, hierarchy, and constant uncertainty. It did not ask people to understand themselves deeply, because deep understanding offered few practical rewards. Instead, it taught them how to endure with minimal disruption. This was not kindness, exactly, but it was functional. And functionality, in that world, was often the highest available standard. When we look back, the mistake is not assuming medieval psychology was entirely wrong. The mistake is assuming it was trying to do the same thing modern psychology does. It was not. It was not interested in self-discovery, emotional freedom, or personal fulfillment. It was interested in stability, predictability, survival. And within those limits, it performed its task remarkably well, not because it understood the mind, but because it asked the mind to stay quiet, stay balanced, and stay out of the way. This expectation that the mind should stay out of the way explains why medieval popular psychology rarely framed emotional suffering as something urgent or exceptional. Pain of the body demanded attention because it interfered with labor and survival. Pain of the mind, unless it became disruptive, was considered part of the background noise of living. Everyone was assumed to carry some degree of unease, sadness, fear, or fatigue. The goal was not to eliminate these states, but to keep them proportionate and invisible. Proportion mattered more than comfort. Visibility mattered more than severity. A person who suffered quietly was functioning correctly. A person who suffered loudly was malfunctioning. Medieval psychology trained people to evaluate mental states externally rather than internally. The question was not, how bad does this feel, but how much trouble does this cause? This made emotional endurance a form of competence. Those who could remain steady under pressure were admired, regardless of what that steadiness cost them internally. Those who could not were corrected, restrained, or reinterpreted until their behavior made sense again. The system was not cruel by design, but it was indifferent by structure. It did not center individual experience, because individual experience was not especially useful in a world governed by fixed roles and limited mobility. Your inner life mattered only insofar as it affected your duties. Medieval popular psychology reflected that reality faithfully. It provided explanations that reinforced endurance and discouraged expectation. Happiness was not assumed to be attainable or even desirable. Contentment, when mentioned, was described as acceptance rather than pleasure. Peace of mind meant not wanting too much, not feeling too intensely, and not questioning too deeply. This framing made dissatisfaction feel like personal failure rather than reasonable response. If you were unhappy, perhaps you had mismanaged yourself. Perhaps you had thought too much, desired too much, or expected too much. The idea that circumstances themselves might be unreasonable was rarely entertained. This inward turn was subtle but powerful. It redirected attention away from the external causes of distress and toward internal regulation. Medieval psychology did not need to suppress dissent aggressively because it taught people to interpret their discomfort as internal imbalance rather than external injustice. Even anger was treated cautiously. Anger could be justified in narrow cases, especially when aligned with authority, but uncontrolled anger was considered dangerous to both body and soul. It overheated the blood, clouded judgment, and disrupted order. Better to cool it, restrain it, and move on. Fear, similarly, was acceptable only in small doses. Excessive fear weakened the heart and spread quickly through communities. Calmness was protective. Silence was stabilizing. Emotional restraint was framed as social responsibility. You were not just managing yourself, you were maintaining the emotional climate of the group. This collective dimension made medieval psychology especially effective. It aligned personal regulation with communal stability. If everyone controlled their emotions, the group remained predictable. Predictability was safety. Safety was survival. The cost was emotional flattening, but that cost was rarely named. It was simply absorbed. Over generations, these assumptions shaped how people narrated their own lives. Personal stories focused on events rather than feelings. Loss was described factually. Hardship was acknowledged briefly, then passed over. Emotional language remained sparse and indirect. This was not because medieval people felt less. It was because they were taught not to dwell on what they felt. Dwelling was dangerous. Dwelling led to imbalance. Better to move forward, perform your role, and trust that endurance itself had value. Medieval popular psychology offered that reassurance repeatedly. If you endured patiently, you were doing it right. If you struggled silently, you were still succeeding. If you failed to endure quietly, you needed correction. This clarity was comforting. It removed ambiguity. It told people exactly what was expected of them, even if it offered very little in return. Modern readers sometimes mistake this for emotional ignorance. In reality, it was emotional discipline, cultivated carefully over time. Medieval society did not lack awareness of suffering. It lacked tolerance for its expression. Psychology, such as it was, existed to manage that gap. It provided language that made restraint sound virtuous and discomfort sound ordinary. It normalized the idea that life was meant to be borne, not improved. This does not mean medieval psychology was uniquely harsh. It was simply aligned with the conditions it served. In a world where change was slow, options were limited, and survival was uncertain, a system that minimized emotional expectation may have felt pragmatic. Hope existed, but it was deferred. Relief existed, but it was temporary. Meaning was found not in feeling better, but in lasting longer. Medieval popular psychology supported that aim with remarkable consistency. It did not promise insight, it promised order. It did not offer healing, it offered endurance. And it delivered those promises quietly, confidently, and with just enough explanation to discourage further questions. This discouragement of further questions is perhaps why medieval popular psychology aged so quietly into habit rather than collapsing under scrutiny. It did not demand belief so much as compliance. You did not have to be convinced it was true. You only had to behave as if it were. Over time, the distinction stopped mattering. Ideas repeated often enough, especially by authority, become background assumptions rather than claims to be tested. Medieval psychology benefited enormously from this. Its explanations were woven into medicine, religion, education, and domestic advice so thoroughly that they stopped looking like theories at all. They looked like reality. If you felt restless, it was natural to assume something inside you was off. If you felt overwhelmed, it made sense to blame excess thought or indulgence rather than circumstances. The framework shaped instinct. It taught people how to interpret their own discomfort before anyone else had to step in. This internalization reduced the need for enforcement. People corrected themselves. They moderated their reactions, limited their expectations, and adjusted their routines without being told. Emotional restraint became second nature. This did not eliminate distress, but it kept it quiet and manageable. The system did not aim for resolution. It aimed for containment. Containment was easier to measure. As long as work continued, prayer was observed, and social order remained intact, the mind was considered adequately managed. Anything beyond that was unnecessary refinement. Even when medieval thinkers disagreed with one another, their disagreements rarely challenged the underlying assumption that the mind was something to be regulated rather than explored. Whether distress came from humors, planets, sin, or habit, the response was the same. Control yourself, adjust your behavior, endure. This consistency made the system stable across centuries, New explanations could be added without changing expectations. A person was still responsible for staying balanced, regardless of how balance was defined that week. Medieval popular psychology also benefited from its vagueness. Because its categories were broad and imprecise, they could fit almost anyone. Few people were perfectly balanced. Most people could recognize themselves in descriptions of excess heat, dampness, melancholy, or agitation. This made the system feel personally relevant without being personally revealing. You could acknowledge imbalance without disclosing details. Diagnosis did not require confession, it required recognition. Once recognized, the path forward was familiar: routine, restraint, repetition. Over time, this created a culture where emotional difficulty was expected and normalized, but not deeply examined. Suffering was not unusual, it was ordinary. The unusual part was talking about it too much. Medieval psychology reinforced this attitude by offering explanations that closed conversations rather than opened them. If your sadness was black bile, there was nothing further to discuss. If your fear was imbalance, the solution was already known. Conversation ended where regulation began. This made the system efficient, but emotionally narrow. It left little room for curiosity, nuance, or individual meaning, but efficiency was valued. In a world where resources were scarce and time was uncertain, efficiency often mattered more than depth. Medieval popular psychology reflected that priority accurately. It was not careless with the mind, it was economical. It spent as little attention as possible on feelings and moved on. For many, this was survivable. For some, it was stabilizing. For others, it was quietly suffocating. But suffocation was rarely named. It blended into the general heaviness of life. People learned to live with it, adjust to it, and rarely expect relief. This expectation shaped emotional memory. People remembered events, losses, and hardships, but not the full texture of how those experiences felt. Feeling deeply was not encouraged, so it was not practiced openly. Over generations, this restraint became cultural inheritance. It influenced how stories were told, how advice was given, and how distress was interpreted. Medieval popular psychology did not just explain the mind, it trained it. It trained people to accept discomfort as normal, to mistrust intense emotion, and to value steadiness above all else. When we look back, it is tempting to focus on the incorrect science, the imaginary fluids, and the borrowed authority. But the more enduring feature was the tone: calm, certain, undemanding. It did not shout, it did not argue. It simply repeated itself until questioning felt unnecessary. And, in doing so, it shaped how generations of people learned to live inside their own minds. Living inside that trained mind meant learning, often without realizing it, which feelings were worth acknowledging and which were better ignored. Mild discomfort was acceptable, deep despair was inconvenient, quiet worry was normal, loud panic was alarming. Medieval popular psychology did not deny that extreme suffering existed, but it treated it as an exception rather than something to be expected or explored. When emotional pain crossed an invisible threshold, it stopped being a matter of balance and became a problem of order. At that point, the individual was no longer simply unwell, but potentially dangerous, unstable, or spiritually compromised. This shift happened quickly and without much sympathy. The same system that encouraged endurance had very little patience when endurance failed. Yet for the majority of people, whose distress never became dramatic enough to demand intervention, medieval psychology functioned as a kind of background instruction manual. It taught people how to interpret their moods in ways that discouraged escalation. Feeling restless did not mean something was wrong with your life. It meant you needed to eat differently, sleep differently, or think less. Feeling hopeless did not require examination. It required discipline. The cause was always nearby and manageable, even if it was imaginary. This framing kept distress small, or at least contained. Over time, people learned to compress their emotional responses to fit the available explanations. If you only have a few categories, you learn to squeeze experience into them. Complex feelings were simplified, contradictions were flattened. You were either balanced or not, improving or failing, calm or excessive. This reduction made life easier to explain, even if it made it harder to feel accurately. Medieval popular psychology favored clarity over truth. It preferred a clean explanation that ended conversation to a messy one that invited questions. This preference shaped how advice was given. Most guidance focused on prevention rather than understanding. Do not let emotions grow too strong. Do not dwell on troubling thoughts. Do not indulge curiosity too far inward. The assumption was that once a feeling became intense, it was already too late. Better to avoid intensity altogether. This produced a cautious emotional culture, one that valued predictability and restraint above insight. People were encouraged to stay within narrow emotional ranges, not because those ranges were healthy, but because they were manageable. The mind was treated like something that needed constant supervision, like a fire that could warm the house if controlled, or burn it down if left unattended. Better to keep it small, better to keep it contained. Medieval popular psychology provided the language to justify this caution. It described emotional excess as physically dangerous, morally risky, and socially disruptive. It described restraint as wisdom. Over time, restraint stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like identity. People did not think of themselves as suppressing emotion. They thought of themselves as sensible, balanced, mature. Emotional intensity became associated with youth, weakness, or lack of discipline. This association persisted even when the theories behind it faded. The categories changed, but the attitude remained. Feel less, want less, expect less. The system worked best when people internalized it fully, when they no longer needed to be told to regulate themselves, when they felt uneasy about strong emotion without knowing why. Medieval psychology succeeded not because it was accurate, but because it aligned emotional behavior with social survival. It taught people how to be tolerable to others under difficult conditions. This is an uncomfortable success to acknowledge, but it explains why these ideas lasted as long as they did. They solved a problem medieval society cared about, not how to make individuals feel better, but how to keep communities functioning under constant strain. Emotional endurance was a resource. Emotional expression was a liability. The psychology of the time reflected that priority clearly. It offered reassurance without relief, explanation without change, and certainty without curiosity. And for many people, that was enough, not because it healed them, but because it gave them a way to continue. Medieval popular psychology did not promise happiness. It promised survival with minimal disruption. It asked people to carry their inner lives quietly and reliably, like tools they did not fully understand but knew how to use. When the tools malfunctioned, they were repaired quickly or set aside. The system moved on, life moved on, and the mind, trained to endure rather than inquire, followed along. Following along in this way meant that medieval people often experienced their inner lives as something slightly separate from themselves, something to be managed rather than inhabited. Feelings were events that happened to you, not messages from you. If they appeared, they were dealt with. If they lingered, they were restrained. If they intensified, they were corrected or reinterpreted until they fit an acceptable explanation. This distance created a peculiar emotional posture. You were close enough to your feelings to notice them, but not close enough to trust them. Trust was reserved for routine, authority, and tradition. Feelings were unreliable. Bodies were unreliable. Balance was the only thing that could be counted on, even if no one could ever quite define it. Medieval popular psychology thrived in this ambiguity. It never had to prove what balance looked like, only what imbalance threatened. Imbalance meant disorder. Disorder meant danger. That was enough. This framing made emotional vigilance a constant, quiet task. People monitored themselves the way they monitored the weather or their supplies, not anxiously, but attentively. Am I too tired? Too restless? Too withdrawn? Too eager? The goal was not self-knowledge, but self-containment. As long as nothing spilled over, you were doing fine. This containment extended into relationships. Emotional dependence was discouraged. Excessive attachment was risky. Love was praised, but preferably restrained and properly ordered. Too much affection weakened judgment. Too much grief undermined faith. Even compassion had limits. You were encouraged to care, but not to be undone by caring. Medieval psychology offered reasons for this restraint. Strong emotion was physically draining. It disrupted humors. It shortened life. These claims were rarely questioned because they aligned with lived experience in a harsh environment. Intense emotion did feel exhausting when resources were scarce and recovery was slow. So restraint felt practical. It felt adult. Over time, this practicality became moralized. Those who controlled themselves were virtuous. Those who did not were suspect. Emotional struggle became evidence of poor regulation rather than reasonable response. This moral layer made medieval popular psychology especially persuasive. It did not just explain feelings, it judged them, and judgment carries weight. People learn quickly what earns approval and what invites correction. Emotional moderation earned approval. Silence earned respect. Endurance earned praise. Complaint earned very little. This shaped not only behavior, but memory. People learned to remember themselves as steadier than they felt, stronger than they were, calmer than reality allowed. Their recorded words often sound restrained because restraint was expected. The absence of emotional language in medieval texts does not mean the absence of emotion. It means emotion was disciplined before it reached the page. Medieval popular psychology helped train that discipline. It provided a shared understanding that intense feeling was something to be smoothed out, not explored. This made collective life more predictable, if less expressive. Communities could rely on each other to behave within narrow emotional bounds. That reliability mattered more than authenticity. Authenticity was not a concept anyone was aiming for. Survival was. When modern readers encounter medieval ideas about the mind, the temptation is to laugh at their confidence and dismiss their ignorance. But doing so misses the deeper function those ideas served. They offered a way to live with constant strain without falling apart publicly. They provided emotional instructions that were easy to follow and hard to argue with. They kept people moving forward, even when forward led nowhere in particular. Medieval popular psychology was not interested in happiness because happiness was unreliable. It was interested in steadiness because steadiness kept life going. And in a world where life demanded constant effort just to continue, that was a convincing priority. This focus on steadiness also meant that medieval people were rarely encouraged to imagine a radically different emotional life for themselves. Improvement, when discussed, was incremental and modest. You might become calmer, more disciplined, less reactive. You were not expected to become fulfilled, self-actualized, or emotionally free. Those ideas would have sounded suspiciously unstable. Medieval popular psychology offered no vision of inner transformation, only maintenance. The mind was something you kept running, not something you redesigned. This limited ambition made disappointment easier to manage. If you did not expect emotional satisfaction from life, its absence did not feel like failure. It felt normal. Suffering was not a sign that something had gone wrong. It was confirmation that life was proceeding as expected. This expectation lowered emotional stakes. You did not wait for things to feel right. You waited for them to be bearable. Bearability was success. Anything beyond that was a bonus. Medieval psychology quietly reinforced this outlook by framing emotional discomfort as temporary, cyclical, or inevitable. Melancholy would come and go. Fear would rise and fall. Desire would flare and fade. You endured each in turn, adjusting routines as needed. There was no promise of resolution, only rotation. This made emotional time feel circular rather than progressive. You were not moving toward healing. You were managing phases. This cyclical view aligned well with agricultural life, religious calendars, and bodily rhythms. Everything returned eventually. Everything passed, then returned again. Expecting permanent relief would have felt unrealistic. The idea that one might permanently solve inner distress would have sounded naive. Medieval popular psychology taught patience with discomfort, not optimism about change. It encouraged people to outlast their feelings rather than understand them. Outlasting required patience, obedience, and low expectation. These qualities were praised repeatedly. Impatience was a flaw. Curiosity was risky. Wanting too much, emotionally or otherwise, was a path to imbalance. This did not mean medieval people never hoped for happiness. They did. But happiness was often deferred beyond this life. Earthly existence was framed as preparation, trial, or endurance. Emotional difficulty fit neatly into that narrative. If life was meant to be hard, then feeling bad was not a problem to solve. It was evidence that the system was working. Medieval popular psychology supported this worldview elegantly. It gave physical explanations for emotional pain that made suffering feel grounded and inevitable rather than meaningless. Black bile did not care about fairness. Planetary influence was not personal. Imbalance happened. You adapted. This removed the need to ask why some people struggled more than others. Difference was explained by temperament rather than injustice. The result was a psychological framework that discouraged comparison and complaint. You had your balance to manage. Others had theirs. If someone seemed happier, perhaps they were simply more balanced. If someone suffered greatly, perhaps their constitution was weaker. These explanations were comforting in their simplicity. They reduced envy and resentment by turning emotional outcomes into personal conditions rather than social ones. Medieval popular psychology did not inspire rebellion. It inspired acceptance. Acceptance was safer. It kept people oriented toward endurance rather than change. And in a society where change was slow, risky, and often violent, acceptance may have felt like wisdom. Modern readers often judge medieval psychology by what it failed to achieve. It did not reduce suffering. It did not foster emotional insight. It did not encourage self-expression. But those were not its goals. Its goal was to help people live with what could not easily be changed. In that sense, it was not careless. It was pragmatic. It met people where they were and told them, calmly and confidently, that what they felt was manageable, expected, and temporary, even if it never truly went away. This message did not heal the mind, but it stabilized it enough to keep life moving. Medieval popular psychology functioned less like therapy and more like infrastructure. It supported daily existence quietly, invisibly, and without asking much in return. And like most infrastructure, it was noticed only when it failed. When that infrastructure did fail, it rarely prompted reconsideration of the system itself. Instead, failure was treated as further evidence that the individual had reached the limits of what could reasonably be managed. Medieval popular psychology did not interpret breakdown as a signal to change approach. It interpreted it as confirmation of fragility. If someone could no longer endure quietly, the assumption was not that the expectations were too heavy, but that the person was too weak, too imbalanced, or too exposed to dangerous influences. This framing preserved the system's authority even when it clearly did not help. There was always another explanation available that did not require structural doubt. Perhaps the humors were exceptionally stubborn. Perhaps the planets were particularly hostile. Perhaps the soul was being tested. These explanations softened blame while still keeping responsibility personal. You were not bad, exactly. You were simply unable. This distinction mattered. It allowed sympathy without reform. Care could be offered without questioning the underlying assumptions. Medieval society did have forms of care, but they were limited, corrective, and often conditional. Support aimed to restore function, not explore meaning. The goal was always return. Return to routine. Return to silence. Return to predictability. If return was impossible, separation followed. Isolation, confinement, or exclusion were not seen as cruelty, but as necessity. The system required stability more than inclusion. Medieval popular psychology provided the rationale for this necessity. It framed emotional excess as contagious, destabilizing, and unsafe. Removing the source protected the whole. This logic made sense in tightly bound communities with few resources and little margin for disruption. Compassion existed, but it had boundaries. Those boundaries were drawn around function. If you could function, you belonged. If you could not, you were managed separately. This was not presented as failure of care, but as realistic limitation. The mind, like the body, sometimes broke beyond repair. When that happened, endurance was no longer expected. Compliance was. Medieval psychology did not imagine recovery in the modern sense. It imagined containment. Containment was safer than hope. Hope required belief in change. Change was uncertain. Medieval life taught people to distrust uncertainty. Better to accept limits clearly defined than chase improvement vaguely promised. This attitude filtered into how people spoke about themselves. Identity was stable. Temperament was fixed. You were sanguine or melancholic, calm or excitable, resilient or fragile. These traits were not paths to be explored. They were facts to be accommodated. You adjusted your life to your temperament, not your temperament to your life. Medieval popular psychology reinforced this alignment constantly. Know yourself, it said, but only in the sense of knowing your limits. Self-knowledge did not mean self-expression. It meant self-restraint. The highest achievement was not emotional fulfillment, but emotional predictability. Predictable people were safe. Safe people were valuable. This value system shaped social trust. Those who displayed strong emotion were treated cautiously. Those who maintained composure were relied upon. Over time, this reinforced the idea that emotional quietness was not just personal discipline, but social currency. It bought you acceptance, stability, and belonging. Medieval popular psychology taught people how to earn that currency reliably. It gave them rules that were simple, repeatable, and rarely questioned. Control your habits, regulate your reactions, expect discomfort, endure patiently. These instructions did not guarantee well-being. They guaranteed order. And in a world where disorder often meant danger, order was worth a great deal. Because order was valued so highly, medieval popular psychology rarely questioned whether the price of that order was too high. Emotional suppression was not framed as loss, but as maturity. What disappeared from public life was assumed to be unnecessary. If certain feelings became harder to express, that was not seen as damage. It was seen as refinement. Civilization, after all, was defined partly by restraint. The ability to hold oneself together under pressure was considered evidence of moral and social development. Medieval psychology reinforced this belief by offering a vocabulary that praised control without ever asking what was being controlled out of existence. People learned to speak fluently about balance while becoming increasingly quiet about experience. The system did not forbid emotion outright. It simply provided so few acceptable ways to express it that most emotions faded into silence on their own. This silence was not empty. It was full of unspoken endurance. People still felt fear, grief, longing, and despair. They simply learned not to linger there publicly, or even privately for very long. Lingering was dangerous. Lingering invited imbalance. Better to redirect attention to tasks, rituals, routines. Work absorbed emotion. Prayer redirected it. Habit smoothed it down. Medieval popular psychology functioned alongside these practices as a kind of explanatory glue. It told people why this constant redirection was necessary. Feelings were volatile. Bodies were unstable. The world was uncertain. Regulation was the only reliable defense. This made emotional control feel less like repression and more like self-preservation. Over time, the distinction blurred entirely. People did not experience themselves as suppressing emotion. They experienced themselves as behaving correctly. This is perhaps why medieval psychology left such a deep imprint, even after its specific theories were abandoned. When humors disappeared from medicine and planets lost their authority, the habit of emotional restraint remained. The language changed, but the instinct survived. Be reasonable. Be composed. Do not overreact. Do not dwell. These ideas feel familiar because they are familiar. They echo long after the original explanations have faded. Medieval popular psychology helped normalize the idea that strong emotion is a problem to be solved rather than a signal to be understood. It taught people to mistrust intensity and reward composure. That lesson did not require belief in black bile to persist. It required only repetition, and repetition, delivered calmly over generations, is powerful. The system did not need to convince people it was right. It needed only to make itself habitual. By the time anyone might have questioned it, it already felt like common sense. This is why medieval psychology is best understood not as a failed science, but as a successful social tool. It aligned emotional behavior with the demands of a rigid, precarious world. It minimized disruption. It discouraged expectation. It taught people how to live with less inner noise, whether they wanted to or not. The cost of this success was subtle. It was paid in emotional vocabulary that never developed, in questions never asked, in meanings never explored. But those absences were quiet. They did not interrupt daily life. And daily life, in the medieval world, demanded uninterrupted continuation. Medieval popular psychology supported that demand efficiently. It did not need to be true. It needed to work. And by the standards of its time, it did. Working, in this case, meant keeping people emotionally functional enough to meet the demands placed on them, not emotionally satisfied by those demands. Medieval popular psychology never promised that life would feel good. It promised that life would continue if managed correctly. This promise shaped expectations at every level. Parents did not raise children to explore their feelings, but to regulate them early. Excessive crying, fear, or excitement was corrected gently at first, then more firmly. Emotional training began long before anyone could name it as such. Children learned which reactions were acceptable by watching which ones were ignored, corrected, or quietly disapproved of. Over time, this training produced adults who needed very little guidance to maintain emotional order. They already knew where the boundaries were. They had felt them long enough to internalize them. Medieval popular psychology relied on this early conditioning to sustain itself. It did not need to intervene constantly. Most people intervened on themselves. This made the system appear natural rather than enforced. It felt like common sense. Of course you should not dwell on sadness. Of course anger should be controlled. Of course fear should be hidden. These were not controversial claims. They were assumptions. When advice was offered, it often sounded obvious because it echoed what people already believed. Eat moderately. Sleep regularly. Avoid extremes. Pray steadily. Do not think too much. Do not feel too much. The simplicity was reassuring. Complex explanations might have invited doubt. Simple ones invited obedience. Medieval popular psychology understood this intuitively. It kept its guidance broad, flexible, and difficult to falsify. If one remedy failed, another could be tried without challenging the premise. If none worked, endurance itself became the measure of success. You did not need to feel better to be doing well. You only needed to continue. This lowered the emotional bar significantly. People could consider themselves successful even while suffering. That success was defined externally. Were you working? Were you behaving? Were you fulfilling your role? If the answer was yes, your internal state was largely irrelevant. Medieval psychology reinforced this separation quietly. It taught people to judge themselves by output rather than experience. This perspective made sense in a labor-driven society with little flexibility. Feelings did not feed families. Work did. Stability mattered more than self-awareness. Emotional efficiency mattered more than emotional accuracy. The system optimized for those values. It produced people who could function under strain, tolerate discomfort, and accept limitation without constant protest. These were valuable traits. They kept communities running. They reduced conflict. They minimized disruption. Medieval popular psychology delivered them reliably. It did not ask whether something was lost in the process. Loss was assumed. Life involved loss. Emotional fullness was not a realistic goal. This acceptance reduced frustration. If you do not expect fulfillment, you are less disappointed by its absence. Medieval psychology quietly encouraged this lowered expectation. It framed emotional restraint not as deprivation, but as wisdom. Wise people did not chase feelings. They maintained balance. This framing elevated endurance into a virtue. It made suffering meaningful without making it optional. You endured because endurance was what life required. Asking for more was risky. It suggested imbalance. It suggested immaturity. It suggested a failure to understand one's place. Medieval popular psychology reinforced hierarchy through this logic. Those at the top were expected to be composed and measured. Those at the bottom were expected to be patient and restrained. Emotional excess at any level was suspect. Control was admired everywhere. This universality made the system feel fair, even when it was not. Everyone was told to endure. Everyone was praised for restraint. The difference lay in who had the resources to make endurance easier. Medieval psychology did not address that difference. It did not need to. Its role was not to question distribution of burden. Its role was to explain how to carry it. Over centuries, this explanation became deeply ingrained. It shaped not only behavior, but imagination. People did not imagine lives centered on emotional satisfaction. They imagined lives centered on duty, rhythm, and survival. When happiness appeared, it was brief, contained, and often associated with communal rituals rather than private fulfillment. Festivals, feasts, holy days, approved moments of release, even joy was scheduled. This scheduling reflected the same impulse as the psychology behind it. Emotion was safest when controlled, shared, and temporary. Medieval popular psychology provided the intellectual justification for this emotional economy. It made restraint seem natural and excess seem dangerous. It did so calmly, repeatedly, and without urgency. It did not need urgency. It had time, and over that time, it succeeded in shaping how people understood their own inner lives, not as spaces for exploration, but as systems to be maintained. Maintaining those inner systems required constant, low-level effort, but medieval popular psychology framed that effort as normal rather than burdensome. You were not struggling, you were simply doing what everyone did. This normalization mattered. It meant emotional labor was invisible. No one congratulated you for regulating your feelings because regulation was assumed. Only failure stood out. Only excess drew attention. This created a culture where people rarely noticed how much energy went into staying balanced. Fatigue, emotional or otherwise, blended into daily life. It was expected. Complaints about tiredness, sadness, or frustration were often met with mild correction rather than concern. Everyone was tired. Everyone carried weight. The fact that you noticed it suggested imbalance. Medieval popular psychology offered language that subtly discouraged reflection on this exhaustion. If you felt worn down, perhaps your humors were depleted. The solution was rest, diet, prayer, and then continued effort. The possibility that the effort itself was the problem rarely entered the conversation. That omission was not accidental. Questioning the cost of endurance would have destabilized the very order the system was designed to protect. So, endurance was framed as sustainable, even when it clearly was not. People learned to pace themselves emotionally, not to avoid exhaustion, but to prevent collapse. There is a difference. Avoiding collapse means you accept exhaustion as baseline, you plan around it, you adjust expectations downward until functioning feels achievable again. Medieval popular psychology encouraged exactly this adjustment. It did not promise relief, it promised manageability. Manageability was enough. Over time, this produced a collective emotional posture that modern readers often misinterpret as stoicism or simplicity. In reality, it was careful calibration. People learned how much they could feel without attracting attention, without disrupting routine, without endangering their standing. This calibration became instinctive. You learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to express grief briefly, and when to return to work, when fear was acceptable, and when it needed to be hidden. Medieval psychology did not teach these rules explicitly. It reinforced them indirectly, through approval, correction, and repetition. The result was emotional competence of a particular kind, not depth but control, not exploration but containment. This competence was rewarded socially. People who mastered it were trusted. People who did not were managed. Over time, this trust became unevenly distributed. Those whose circumstances made emotional control easier were seen as naturally balanced. Those under greater strain were more likely to appear imbalanced and thus morally suspect. Medieval popular psychology did not account for this disparity. It interpreted outcome as character. If you struggled more, you were weaker. If you endured quietly, you were virtuous. This interpretation protected hierarchy without naming it. It made inequality appear natural rather than constructed. Emotional outcomes became evidence of inner quality rather than external pressure. This is one of the quieter ways medieval psychology shaped society. It aligned emotional success with moral worth. Without requiring explicit judgment, people judged themselves accordingly. They learned to measure their value by how little trouble they caused, how steadily they worked, how quietly they suffered. These measures became internal standards. You did not need others to enforce them. You enforced them yourself. Medieval popular psychology succeeded most fully at this level. It became internal voice rather than external rule. It taught people how to talk to themselves about their own distress, not with curiosity or compassion, but with correction. Be patient. Be restrained. Do not indulge. Do not dwell. This voice was calm. It sounded reasonable. It rarely raised its volume. And because it sounded reasonable, it was difficult to argue with. Over time, it replaced other possible voices. Voices that might have asked whether endurance was necessary, whether suffering could be reduced, whether different lives were imaginable. Those questions were not forbidden. They simply never became habits. Medieval popular psychology did not silence people loudly. It trained them quietly. And quiet training, repeated across generations, is one of the most durable forms of influence there is. This durability meant that medieval popular psychology did not need to be defended aggressively. It persisted because it blended into everyday reasoning so completely that alternatives barely registered as possibilities. People did not ask what other emotional frameworks might exist, because imagining alternatives required the very kind of introspection and dissatisfaction the system discouraged. Curiosity about one's inner life was allowed only within narrow bounds. Too much curiosity suggested imbalance. Too much questioning suggested restlessness. Restlessness was a problem to be corrected, not a signal to be followed. In this way, medieval psychology quietly limited imagination. Not just imagination about feelings, but imagination about life itself. If your emotional world was fixed and managed, rather than explored, then your sense of what could change externally also narrowed. Acceptance became reflexive. Endurance became identity. This had practical benefits. It reduced friction in a rigid society. It helped people adapt to roles they did not choose and conditions they could not escape. It also came at a cost that was rarely articulated. When endurance becomes central to identity, suffering loses its urgency. Pain becomes background. Distress becomes routine. Medieval popular psychology normalized this routine thoroughly. It made ongoing discomfort feel expected, even appropriate. People learned not to interpret suffering as a call for change, but as confirmation that they were participating correctly in life. This reframing stabilized communities, but it also slowed recognition of harm. If emotional pain is always manageable through restraint, then there is little reason to question why it exists so consistently. Medieval psychology did not encourage that question. It redirected attention toward personal regulation instead. This redirection shaped moral judgment as well. Those who struggled visibly were not just unfortunate, they were suspect. Their inability to endure quietly suggested imbalance, weakness, or improper discipline. Compassion existed, but it was conditional. It extended only as far as the expectation of eventual control. If control did not return, sympathy often hardened into distance. Medieval popular psychology provided justification for this shift. It framed emotional failure as deviation rather than evidence of strain. Deviation threatened order. Order required boundaries. Boundaries required enforcement. This logic was rarely made explicit, but it was widely understood. It guided responses intuitively. People knew when to help and when to withdraw. They knew when distress was acceptable and when it had become inconvenient. This intuitive understanding was one of the system's most effective features. It did not require rules. It required shared assumptions. Those assumptions were taught early, reinforced often, and rarely challenged. Over time, they felt natural. It felt natural to expect endurance. It felt natural to admire restraint. It felt natural to distrust intensity. Medieval popular psychology did not invent these instincts, but it organized them into a coherent worldview. It gave people a way to think about their inner lives that aligned neatly with the demands placed upon them. The system did not need to comfort deeply. It needed to function reliably, and it did. It provided explanations that were simple enough to remember, flexible enough to apply broadly, and authoritative enough to discourage doubt. When life was hard, it told people that hardness was normal. When feelings were heavy, it told them to lighten themselves rather than question the load. This message was not kind in a modern sense, but it was consistent. Consistency matters when options are few. Medieval popular psychology offered consistency above all else. It made the mind predictable, manageable, and largely silent. In doing so, it helped people survive worlds that offered very little room for emotional negotiation. Whether that survival came at too high a cost was not a question the system encouraged anyone to ask. Not asking that question was, in many ways, the final success of medieval popular psychology. By the time its assumptions were fully absorbed, questioning endurance itself felt unnecessary, even indulgent. Why ask whether the cost was too high, when cost was assumed to be unavoidable? Life was effort. Survival was effort. Feeling was effort. The goal was not to reduce effort, but to distribute it quietly and evenly over time. Medieval psychology encouraged exactly this distribution. Do not feel everything at once. Do not expect relief quickly. Spread endurance thinly across years. This pacing made long hardship survivable. It also made it invisible. When strain is constant but moderate, it rarely triggers alarm. It becomes background condition rather than crisis. Medieval popular psychology normalized that background so thoroughly that many people likely could not imagine an alternative. Their inner lives were shaped around managing discomfort rather than escaping it. This shaped how hope functioned. Hope was allowed, but it was narrow and distant. It focused on stability, not transformation. A good year, a healthy season, a peaceful household. These were realistic hopes. Emotional fulfillment, deep satisfaction, or inner clarity were not common aspirations. They belonged to saints, mystics, or the afterlife. Ordinary people aimed lower. Medieval psychology reinforced this modesty of desire. Wanting less was safer. Expecting less was wiser. This lowered emotional ambition, reduced disappointment, but it also limited possibility. People did not expect their feelings to guide them toward better lives. Feelings were signals of imbalance, not direction. If something felt wrong, the answer was to adjust yourself, not to move away. This inward adjustment preserved external stability. It also trapped people in conditions that quietly harmed them. Medieval popular psychology did not see this as a problem. Harm that did not disrupt order was tolerable. The system was not designed to detect slow damage. It was designed to prevent sudden collapse. Sudden collapse was dangerous. Slow erosion was manageable. This distinction mattered. It explains why certain kinds of suffering were ignored while others provoked immediate response. Panic, rage, or visible breakdown threatened others. Quiet despair did not. Quiet despair could be absorbed. Medieval psychology helped absorb it efficiently. It gave people explanations that made despair feel personal, temporary, or inevitable. It discouraged collective recognition of shared strain. Each person managed their own balance. If many people felt worn down, that was coincidence, not pattern. Patterns would have required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement might have led to questions. Questions were destabilizing. Better to keep distress individualized and private. Medieval popular psychology achieved this without coercion. It offered people a way to interpret their own pain that did not implicate anyone else. You were tired because you were imbalanced. You were sad because your temperament leaned that way. You were anxious because you thought too much. These explanations were simple, immediate, and closed. They ended inquiry. Over time, this closure became comforting. Knowing why you felt bad, even incorrectly, was better than not knowing at all. Uncertainty was unsettling. Medieval psychology replaced uncertainty with confident error, and confident error, delivered calmly and repeatedly, is surprisingly soothing. It does not ask you to solve your problems. It asks you to accept them correctly. That acceptance reduced friction. It kept life moving. And for people with few options and little control, movement itself was relief. Medieval popular psychology did not offer freedom from suffering. It offered a method for carrying it without stopping. And in a world where stopping often meant danger, that method had real value. That value explains why medieval popular psychology rarely faced open resistance, even from those it served poorly. It did not feel imposed. It felt inherited. People encountered its ideas not as doctrines to accept, but as assumptions already in place. By the time someone was old enough to notice their inner discomfort, they already knew how to interpret it. The language was ready. The explanations were familiar. There was little sense that another interpretation might exist. This made medieval psychology feel less like instruction and more like description. It was simply how things were. You felt this way because bodies worked this way. Minds behaved this way. The world demanded this response. The system rarely needed to justify itself because it aligned so closely with daily experience. Life was hard. Feelings were heavy. Control mattered. Medieval popular psychology did not soften those realities. It organized them. Organization itself can feel like relief. When suffering has a name and a place, it becomes less frightening, even if it does not become smaller. The humors, the temperaments, the cycles of imbalance provided a map. It was not an accurate map, but it was a map nonetheless. And for people navigating constant uncertainty, any map was better than none. This is an important reason the system endured. It offered orientation. You might not be able to change your path, but you could understand where you were on it. Melancholy season, period of imbalance, time of trial. These labels did not resolve distress, but they framed it. Framing reduced chaos. Chaos was the true enemy. Medieval popular psychology positioned itself as protection against chaos of the inner life. It did not need to be correct to do that. It needed to be coherent, and it was. Every feeling had a cause. Every cause had a remedy. Every remedy reinforced the same underlying message. Regulate yourself. Endure quietly. Return to balance. This coherence made the system resilient. When parts of it were questioned, others remained intact. When medical ideas shifted, moral ones filled the gap. When religious explanations weakened, bodily ones took their place. The core assumption never changed. The mind was not a mystery to be explored. It was a mechanism to be maintained. This assumption shaped how people related to themselves. Inner life became something slightly impersonal. You observed it. You adjusted it. You did not identify with it too closely. Identification would have made suffering harder to bear. Distance made endurance possible. Medieval psychology encouraged that distance consistently. It treated feelings as conditions rather than identities. You were not sad. You had melancholy. You were not anxious. You were imbalanced. This subtle grammatical shift mattered. It allowed people to carry emotional pain without letting it define them. That separation was protective. It also limited self-understanding. But protection often comes with trade-offs. Medieval popular psychology prioritized protection over insight. It aimed to keep people functional under pressure, not to help them understand why the pressure existed. In that sense, it was honest about its purpose. It did not pretend to offer liberation. It offered management. And management was often enough to get through another day, another season, another year. Medieval life did not promise more than that. Psychology reflected that promise accurately. It did not raise expectations it could not meet. It did not suggest that feeling deeply would lead to improvement. It suggested that feeling moderately would lead to stability. Stability was achievable. Stability was valuable. And stability, even when emotionally thin, was preferable to collapse. Medieval popular psychology delivered that message patiently, consistently, and with very little variation. That patience is why it lasted. That patience also explains why medieval popular psychology left such faint traces of open dissatisfaction. People did not record frustration with the system because frustration itself would have been interpreted as imbalance. To complain about emotional expectations was to demonstrate failure to meet them. Silence, therefore, became proof of success. The absence of complaint was taken as evidence that the system worked, when in reality, it often meant people had learned not to articulate what they felt. Medieval popular psychology did not suppress speech directly. It shaped what felt speakable. Some experiences fit the accepted vocabulary. Others did not. Those that did not were either translated into something acceptable or left unspoken. Over time, this selective expression narrowed emotional awareness. People became skilled at noticing only what could be managed. Anything too complex, too contradictory, or too painful to fit existing explanations was ignored or reframed. This did not make suffering disappear. It made it harder to recognize. Medieval psychology encouraged people to see endurance as success, not as cost. If you were still functioning, you were doing well. If you were exhausted but quiet, you were admirable. This reframing prevented accumulation of visible crisis. Instead of sudden breakdowns, there was gradual wear. Gradual wear is difficult to notice, especially when it affects everyone. When everyone is tired, tiredness feels normal. Medieval popular psychology normalized that state expertly. It did not present endurance as exceptional. It presented it as baseline. This baseline shaped identity. People thought of themselves as resilient not because they felt strong, but because they had no alternative. Resilience became descriptive rather than aspirational. You endured because that was what people did. There was no heroism in it. There was no narrative arc, just continuation. Medieval psychology supported this flatness. It did not tell stories of inner triumph. It told instructions for maintenance. That lack of drama made it compatible with everyday life. Drama disrupts routine. Routine sustains survival. The system favored the latter. This also meant that moments of genuine emotional insight, when they occurred, stood outside ordinary frameworks. Mystics, poets, and visionaries described inner experiences that did not fit humoral balance or moral correction. Their language was intense, symbolic, and often troubling. Medieval society tolerated these voices cautiously. They were admired when safely isolated, suspect when influential. Popular psychology did not absorb them. It left them at the margins. The mainstream system remained focused on regulation. It did not aim to explain everything. It aimed to explain enough. Enough to keep most people moving, working, and cooperating. That limited aim was its strength. Overambitious systems collapse under their own promises. Medieval popular psychology promised very little. In return, it asked for endurance, restraint, and acceptance. Those were available resources. They could be cultivated even in scarcity. And so the system persisted. It was not because people were unaware of suffering. It was because the system offered a way to live alongside suffering without letting it dominate collective life. That coexistence was uncomfortable, but it was stable. Stability was the priority. When modern readers encounter medieval psychological ideas, they often ask how anyone could have believed them. A better question might be why they were so easy to live with. They did not demand introspection, growth, or transformation. They demanded compliance and patience. For people with limited power and few options, those demands were realistic. Medieval popular psychology did not imagine better inner lives. It imagined manageable ones. And for a society built around endurance, manageability was enough. Enough, in the medieval sense, meant that life could proceed without drawing attention to itself. And medieval popular psychology succeeded precisely because it helped people remain unnoticed in their own suffering. It taught them how to be emotionally small, not insignificant, but contained. Your feelings were allowed, as long as they fit the scale of everyday life. Anything larger threatened to spill into disorder. This containment shaped how people thought about time as well. Emotional difficulty was rarely framed as a turning point or a crisis. It was just another stretch to endure. Days were heavy, weeks passed, seasons turned. The mind adapted because it had to. Medieval psychology encouraged this adaptation by treating emotional states as weather rather than messages. Storms passed, fog lifted, cold returned. You dressed accordingly and waited. This metaphor mattered. Weather is not negotiated with, it is managed. You prepare, endure, and move on. Medieval popular psychology trained people to treat their inner lives the same way. Do not ask why the storm came. Ask how to survive it. This perspective reduced disappointment, but also reduced agency. If feelings were weather, then they were not guides. They did not tell you where to go. They only told you how to brace yourself. Over time, people stopped expecting feelings to be useful beyond that. Emotional information was not explored. It was tolerated. This made inner life quieter, flatter, and more predictable. Predictability was valuable. It made people easier to live with, easier to govern, easier to rely on. Medieval psychology supported all of those outcomes without ever stating them directly. It simply repeated its message calmly until alternatives felt unnecessary. When the system finally began to loosen, centuries later, it was not because people suddenly discovered that medieval psychology was wrong. It was because the conditions it served began to change. As lives became less rigid, as mobility increased, as personal choice expanded slightly, endurance alone became insufficient. New expectations crept in. People began to imagine that feelings might matter for more than regulation, that they might signal injustice, incompatibility, or harm. Medieval popular psychology had no answer for those ideas. It was not built to address them. But while it lasted, it did exactly what it was meant to do. It provided a quiet framework for surviving lives that offered little control and few alternatives. It made suffering manageable by making it ordinary. It made endurance virtuous by making it necessary. It gave people explanations that closed questions rather than opened them. And it delivered those explanations with a tone that discouraged resistance, calm, certain, undramatic. In that sense, medieval popular psychology was not an intellectual failure. It was an emotional technology, optimized for stability rather than truth. It shaped how people related to their own minds for generations, teaching them to accept discomfort as background, to mistrust intensity, and to value composure above insight. When we listen to it now, centuries later, it can sound distant, even absurd, with its humors and planetary influences. But the deeper lesson it taught remains familiar. Endure quietly. Adjust yourself. Do not expect too much. Those ideas did not disappear with medieval medicine. They simply changed vocabulary. The reason medieval popular psychology still feels strangely recognizable is not because it understood the mind well, but because it understood something else very clearly. That when life offers few choices, certainty is comforting, restraint is stabilizing, and endurance is easier to teach than change. Medieval psychology taught people how to live inside those constraints with minimal disruption. It did not promise happiness. It promised continuity. And for a world that valued survival above all else, continuity was the most realistic comfort available.